Welcome, Gunrunner.
When you have a system as successful as the NES was, you also have a pretty huge games library to go alongside it. Close to 1,000 commercial releases no less. And when trying to make a video like this, that selection becomes somewhat of a headache. Even when we look at exclusive NES games alone, there are around 400 different releases to focus on, which doesn't really make the job that much easier. So it's fair to say that getting that down to a list of just 10 titles that I felt were worthy for inclusion was a pretty daunting task. I knew that I would have to approach this video in a different way to many of my other great exclusives videos, so rather than picking out the most highly regarded titles, I chose to adopt a new strategy. I simply picked the 10 exclusives that I personally enjoy playing the most. Makes sense, right? Well, it does, but it also means that there will be more than a few games that people will probably expect to see covered here that aren't. But don't get upset, just revel in our differences, and hopefully you'll learn something new too. It would be pretty boring if we all had the same opinions, right?
Are you ready? Is your family ready for the incredible Nintendo Entertainment System? Are you ready for Rob, the extraordinary video robot? He follows the commands you put on the screen to help you tackle even the toughest challenge. Are you ready to shoot with the incredibly accurate zapper and play games like Duck Hunt or Mike Tyson's Punch-Out and The Legend of Zelda? The Nintendo Entertainment System. It's waiting for you at Boots now.
If you loved Micro Machines and the original Wave Race on the Game Boy, then this obscure but also underrated game will be right up your street. Essentially, it's a one-on-one race to the finish where you're trying to beat the other boat, get the best time, and ultimately earn some dosh you can upgrade and enhance your high-powered speedboat. The game is especially interesting in that while it's mostly seen from a top-down perspective, for certain parts of each race it switches to behind the boat viewpoint, which is a really nice touch. There are a large selection of different courses that you can compete on, with harder ones gaining you more money, and a selection of different opponents to face too. While you race, you must also be careful not to crash, because this will damage your boat and you'll end up spending all your money repairing it. You can also rescue people who are stranded in the water to earn bonus cash too. Graphically, the game is rather good, and I especially like the opening sequence where you see the two boats roaring to go at the starting line. The audio is of an equal high quality with some nice tunes and plenty of good sound effects too. On your own, Eliminate a Boat Duel is a very fun and enjoyable game, and it raises it a notch higher when you add a second player into the equation too. If you like top-down racing games, then this is definitely one worth picking up. Now I'm sure that most people reading this will be thinking, hey, Bobble II is Rainbow Islands, isn't it? And that would be my thinking too, so I was initially quite shocked to learn about the rather confusing existence of this game. Just to confuse matters further, there is also a Bobble II for the Game Boy in the West too, which has similar themes to this one, but is a different game, and was originally known as Bobble Jr. in Japan. I'm guessing that Taito anticipated this confusion, which is why they went for Part 2, inferring that it follows straight on from the first game, somewhat like DLC. But the actual game does feature some rather notable changes that set it apart. There are two major alterations that need to be picked up on in particular, one good and one bad. So let's get the bad one out the way first, shall we? There is no simultaneous two-player mode. You now have to take it in turns, which is very sad indeed. But there is a new gameplay mechanic that allows you to float upwards, which is definitely a very welcome addition. Whilst the rest of the basic gameplay is much the same, there are also new bonus stages, upgraded graphics and large bosses to defeat too. As well as those great new visuals, there's a brand new soundtrack too, which I have to say is absolutely terrific. Okay, so Bobble II isn't quite as great as the first game, but it's still a hugely enjoyable title nonetheless. In pretty much every way, Crystal Mines is just a clone of the classic Boulder Dash, but that certainly isn't a bad thing, especially when it's done as well as this. The idea is exactly the same, to dig around underground collecting all the diamonds and then escaping the level. The only difference between the two games is that instead of controlling cute little Rockford with his shovel, you are now a robot with a laser gun. This is used to both clear dirt and kill enemies, which is another nice change from Boulder Dash, where the only way to kill a foe was to drop a boulder on their head. This provides a little more arcade action to the puzzling, but you still need to work out the best way to complete each level and not get trapped. Each level also has a time limit too, so there isn't much time to muck around planning your escape. You'll also need to watch out for the various power-ups that can be collected to aid your cause. There are an incredible 100 standard levels in this game, which all have a unique password, so you can return where you left off, and more than a few secrets to discover too. The graphics aren't anything special, but they are very clear and well defined, which is what counts in a game like this. The sound is great though, with both effects and a wide range of in-game tunes. Boulder Dash fans will definitely love Crystal Mines, and it's easily the best game Color Dreams release for the NES. The first thing I should mention about this game is that, like many other NES games that share the same name as a coin-op, this is a totally different game to its arcade parent. I'm not usually a fan of the change, but in this case it works really well. The NES Bionic Commando is a much deeper game with a lot more to it. The plot is also very different too, as in this game you don't actually play as Super Joe. Instead you have to rescue him. The game involves travelling to different locations to gather the intelligence needed to find Joe. You choose where you want to go on a map, and then you search the level for doors. Inside the doors are computers that can be used for either contacting HQ to send and retrieve messages, and to intercept enemy communications to get the intel needed to find your friend. This also helps you choose where to go next on the map, not just to help find Joe, but also to avoid the travelling enemy forces. Bionic Commando on the NES is basically an arcade adventure where you use the grappling hook to negotiate platforms rather than jumping, which works really well. The graphics look really nice with varied levels and well-defined sprites. The music is very good indeed, with many of the tunes in the arcade game included. This is without doubt one of my favourite games for the Nintendo Entertainment System, and a real show of Capcom at their very best. It has to be said that the UK European launch lineup for the NES was pretty poor, but amongst the hordes of crusty old games that we'd already finished playing on our 8-bit home computers was one true gem, Excitebike. Without doubt, this is one of the best original titles and was also familiar to arcade goers as one of the games that appeared on the Nintendo Play Choice coin-op under the Versus Excitebike guise. In summary, this title is a side-on scrolling dirt bike racing game where you compete against computer-controlled players to try and win the Excitebike Championship. By finishing in third place or above, you qualify for the next race, with predefined times being set that you must beat. As well as the standard racing, you can also make your racer perform a multitude of different stunts by going off the many jumps that litter each course, though this doesn't actually serve you any benefit apart from looking cool. You must also make sure that you don't hit any other racers, as this causes you to fall off your bike or get stuck in the gravel. Both instances cost you valuable time. The most interesting element of Excitebike though is where you have to try and control your engine temperature so that your bike doesn't overheat. When you also have the course designer to play with, you just can't make an argument for not adding Excitebike to your NES collection. When it comes to scrolling beat-em-ups, Capcom's Final Fight is without doubt one of the most celebrated, but many people don't seem to realise that it actually got a release for the then rather creaky Nintendo NES in the summer of 1993. This somewhat unknown status is probably because it came so late in the system's life, rather than it actually being a rubbish game, because it's actually one of the best beat-em-ups on the console, hence its inclusion in this video. Most people are also quite startled to see the radical change in the game's visual design, with these graphics far closer resembling the seminal River City Ransom and the Kunio-kun games it descended from than Capcom's classic coin-op. They did keep the plot the same as the arcade game however, and it features the same cast of characters. The basic gameplay is also much more reminiscent too, if a bit more simplified. Mighty Final Fight does fall down a little though, in only being a one-player game, much like the NES version of Double Dragon for that matter, but this is probably of little consequence for those playing the game these days. Another similarity between both games is that Mighty Final Fight also features an experience-based point system, where you must level up your character in order to succeed. This is yet another NES classic for the folks at Capcom, and a very worthy pickup. Nintendo's own Pinball was one of the earliest games released for the NES, and is a fairly simple attempt to replicate the fun of a real table. You have a basic 2-screen 2D top-down display with rudimentary bumpers, ramps and flippers. You start off on the top table, so if your ball drops through your flippers you move into the second table, where it is possible to hit your ball back up. There are also bonus multipliers and a special bonus stage too, which I will explain further. This sub-game is actually very neat, as instead of flippers, you move none other than Mario himself back and forth whilst trying to hold up a girder to hit the ball back. He does this to try and save his girlfriend Pauline, who was previously seen in Donkey Kong but later replaced in the Mario universe by Princess Peach. This makes a nice little diversion to the rest of the game, and after you complete it the table changes slightly. There are also 2 difficulty modes in the game, as well as the option to complete as well as the option to compete against a second player for the high score. Graphically, the game is fairly basic, but there is definitely a certain amount of charm to it. In the sound department, there isn't much more than a set of simple sound effects. For such an early video pinball game, the ball physics are very well implemented, and despite being pretty simple, pinball is still very fun, even if it was later eclipsed by games like Pinball. If ever a title of a game summed up the 80s, then this is it. Back in the days when everything was totally rad, Square came up with their own clone of Sega's Outrun for the NES. Although the inspiration is clear, it does have a few unique features of its own though. The first of these features is that you can select the type of car you play as, the first of which is the Turbo 328, obviously based on a Ferrari, and the second is a Formula 1 car. Depending on which car you choose, the other vehicles on the road are different too. With the 328, the other cars resemble real-life motors like VW Beetles, Corvettes and pickup trucks. If you go for the F1 car, then you'll just be racing against other F1 cars. In Rad Racer, you also have extra joypad controls. Pressing up activates your turbo, and pressing down changes the radio station for different music. This is really cool, but it is a little easy to just press this by mistake. One of the best parts of this game is the epic crashes. If you hit another car, you just bump off them. They hit some of the roadside scenery and you flip up in the air, spinning around multiple times. Rad Racer looks fantastic with its amazing sense of speed and detailed backdrops. The sound is also great with the realistic engine noises and choice of music. Rad Racer is widely regarded as the best racing game on the NES, and I definitely subscribe to that opinion. This game really is radical. Pretty much all retro gamers are familiar with the original track and field game. It was the first Olympic-based button basher to hit the arcades and spawned numerous clones. People are less familiar with its brilliant sequel though, that was first released on the NES in 1988. There are an amazing 12 events in this game: fencing, triple jump, freestyle swimming, high dive, clay pigeon shooting, hammer throw, taekwondo, pole vault, canoeing, archery, hurdles and horizontal bars. You can choose to practice these events, compete head to head with another player, or go for the full Olympic experience. Each event is incredibly well done, and the way they are set out gives a really nice balance. Nobody wants to just bash a button through the whole game, and Track and Field 2 requires you to really learn how to play many of the events. If you found the number of events on offer staggering, then you'll be blown away by the visuals. They're probably the best graphics I've seen on the NES. They look almost 16-bit with their often huge well animated sprites and attention to detail. It's no slouch in the sound department either, as Track and Field 2 has some excellent tunes and effects playing throughout the game. If you are into your sports, then this is a simply unmissable title for your collection. Even if you don't like them, you might be wanting to give it a try anyway. You might be pleasantly surprised. After the horror that was the original Double Dragon on the NES, I wasn't expecting much from its sequel, but I couldn't have been more wrong. In my opinion, what we have here is the best game ever released for the 8-bit Nintendo. Like the conversion of the first game, this doesn't follow the original arcade iteration either, but still has a loose connection associated with it. The levels are completely different but follow many of the same themes, and feature many of the same bad guys too. They also copied the control method from the Double Dragon 2 arcade game, with the 2 buttons attack in different directions rather than straight ahead of you. This is really weird at first but actually works quite well once you get the hang of it, and it eliminates cheap attacks from behind. The sequel still has the problem of only having 2 enemies on screen at once, as found in the original NES game. There is far less flicker than before, and even more importantly, it's actually 2-player now. The levels are larger, the graphics are better, there are more weapons, better bosses, and no stupid heart level up system. Then there's the great music, and whilst the tunes in this sequel are not quite as iconic, they're still very good indeed. Double Dragon 2 is so superior in every way to its predecessor, and is without doubt one of the best scrolling beat-em-ups on any 8-bit console, especially if you have an NES Advantage joystick.
Now comes the ultimate challenge from Nintendo. The challenge of stopping World War III and becoming Top Gun. The challenge of Hogan's Alley, where survival depends on a steady hand. The challenge of fighting 7 contenders before taking on Tyson to become world champion. You can take up the challenge with over 50 adventures from Nintendo. Parents can ring 015464646 for information now. Nintendo, the world's #1 game system.
And that rounds up my look at 10 amazing exclusives for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Can you think of any other great exclusives for the NES that I should have made the list? Or do you think some of these games were unworthy of inclusion? I always love to hear the thoughts and views of my audience, so please get typing in that comments section. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons for continuing to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following patrons in particular for their much appreciated pledges: Ritual Valentino, Neptune, Seth A. Robinson, Carl Olsen, Dos Gamerman, Tiago Piero dos Santos Silva, and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support all my creative endeavours, including this YouTube channel, then please go and check out my Patreon right now. You can get access to host director content, including downloads, exclusive videos, creative insights, and much more besides. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.